This will be the first of 2 videos that discuss the digestive system. You know what organ you're looking at here? This is the large intestine. The digestive system consists of the alimentary canal, or GI tract, and accessory organs. The GI tract is nothing more than a muscular tube, extends from the mouth to the anus, and the accessory organs are those that provide secretions along the way, like the pancreas, for example. The GI tract is pretty long. This is about 1.5 feet from mouth to the base to the distal end of the stomach. The small intestine is about 20 feet. The large intestine about 5 feet. So it could extend upward to a length of 30 feet. 30 feet is a little long. That's more likely the length of intestines on a cadaver. An individual that's still alive, their intestines will be shorter because they'll be, remember, that's a muscular organ, so the muscle will maintain some tone and will be somewhat constricted, or at least contracted, rather, at least at certain portions. So more like maybe 20 feet. Digestion includes mechanical digestion, like what might occur in the mouth, which is breaking of larger pieces of food into smaller pieces of food, and chemical digestion, which is breaking down large nutrient molecules into small molecules. So, for example, breaking down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars, or breaking down large proteins into smaller amino acids. So let's look at the GI tract. We have the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus. So here it is, the mouth, the pharynx, which is the back of the throat, the esophagus, the stomach. All this in light purple is the small intestine, and here in red is the large intestine, and then the rectum and the anus. And the accessory organs are salivary glands, liver, gallbladder, pancreas. Here's the salivary gland, there's the liver, there's the gallbladder, and sitting behind the stomach is the pancreas. Let's look at the general structures of the wall of the GI tract. We have epithelium, connective tissue, and 2 layers of smooth muscle. Let's first look at the 2 layers of smooth muscle. So we have a longitudinal layer that runs the length of the lumen, or the lumen is like the open part, the length of the tube. And we have circular muscles that run in a circle around the tube. So between the 2 of these will contract and they'll push food along the digestive tract. And we have connective tissue. We have connective tissue in the mesentery that suspends the intestines. We also have connective tissue also just built right into the wall. So here's some connective tissue, here's some connective tissue there. And then epithelium. The epithelium that is shown here on this villi is simple columnar epithelium. You can see it right there. Here's the simple columnar epithelium, a micrograph. And then here it is, a larger cartoon. You can see here's a simple columnar epithelium, and then here's some microvilli that increase surface area. It's extremely important to know that this is just the general structure of the wall. The stomach looks different than the small intestine, which looks different than the large intestine, which looks different than the anus. So it looks different everywhere, but it sort of has this general structure: epithelium, connective tissue, and then a couple layers of muscle. And like I mentioned before, peristalsis, that's a wave-like contraction that propels food. You probably heard this before, but you can even drink or eat food while standing on your head. So it's not gravity that moves food down into your stomach, it's peristalsis. Before I move to the next slide, I want to point out one more thing. Notice there's folds. These folds allow for expansion and also increased surface area. And then if we zoom in, we see this is a villus. Multiple villus would be called villi. These villi also increase the surface area, so specialized for absorption and secretion. And then even further still, on top of the simple columnar epithelium, we have these microvilli, which increase our surface area yet again. So we have villi and microvilli. So one of these here that I'm circling would be a villi, and then the microvilli, that's the dark purple band just on the apical, very apical surface of those simple columnar cells. Let's look at the mouth first. There'll be no surprises here. The mouth is the opening of the GI tract. Stratified squamous epithelium. That's also not a surprise because the mouth isn't specialized for absorption. The mouth is specialized for mechanical digestion. So this needs to be a barrier, protective barrier. And then, of course, begins mechanical digestion. That'd be chewing with the teeth, and also chemical digestion, as we'll see right now, in fact. The salivary glands. There's three. There's the parotid gland. That's right in front of your ear. You can feel that right now if you'd like. You have the submandibular gland, which is right beneath your mandible, and then the sublingual salivary gland, which is right underneath your tongue. Those secrete watery fluid and mucus, so that moistens and softens the food and allows the food to clump together to prepare for swallowing. And it also secretes salivary amylase. That's what I mentioned on the previous slide, where this begins chemical digestion of carbohydrates. So amylase breaks down carbohydrates. I underlined ACE. Anytime you see a word that ends in ACE, there's a pretty good chance that it's an enzyme. And enzymes break things down. So amylase breaks down carbohydrates into simpler sugars. This is a micrograph of a salivary gland. This is like the glandular tissue here. This is a type of epithelium. And then we also have ducts. Some of these ducts might be simple cuboidal or even maybe stratified cuboidal. I'm not sure. The pharynx is just another name for the back of the throat. So behind the nasal cavity, we have the nasal pharynx. Behind the oral cavity, we have the oral pharynx. And behind the larynx, we have the laryngopharynx. So we'll just call all of this area the pharynx. And that's just the back of the throat. And that's a tube that connects the mouth to the esophagus. Speaking of the esophagus connects the pharynx to the stomach. It passes through an opening here in the diaphragm called the esophageal hiatus. So here's a picture of the diaphragm, and here's the esophageal hiatus right here. The diaphragm passes through this opening. This is of significance we'll see in just a moment. So the esophagus has a thickening of the muscle at the distal end. Remember, this would be like the proximal end. This would be the distal end. And where it thickens is oftentimes called the lower esophageal sphincter or the cardiac sphincter. That thickening prevents stomach contents or stomach acid from splashing back up into the esophagus. The esophagus doesn't have the protective barrier that the stomach does, so when acid and food content splash up in the esophagus, that's where you get acid reflux or heartburn. It's possible for some of the stomach to actually push through this esophageal hiatus. If it does that, it can balloon out above the diaphragm. That's called a hiatal hernia. You've probably heard of hernia before. There's inguinal hernias, there's umbilical hernias, but this particular type of hernia is when the stomach pokes through the esophageal hiatus, called a hiatal hernia. Let's look at the stomach. The stomach is a J-shaped organ in the upper left quadrant of the abdominal cavity. And it had these rugae, or rugae, gastric folds, and what they do is upon the entry of food, these folds allow for expansion or distension of the stomach. The stomach without food in it only holds a few ounces, but it's able to expand, of course, and hold up to 2 to 4 liters. So that's almost a gallon that can be held in your stomach. The cardia, it's close to the cardiac sphincter. That's this portion of the stomach. There's the fundus, which is the most superior portion of the stomach. The larger part in the middle is called the body. And then we also have this region down here where it begins to transition to the small intestine. It's called the pylorus. This is the pylorus. The stomach secretes something called gastric juice. Gastric juice is kind of like a cocktail of enzymes and acids. One component of gastric juice is mucus that protects the stomach. So it literally keeps the stomach from digesting itself. That mucus does. There's pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme that breaks down proteins. Hydrochloric acid, that activates pepsin. So actually when pepsin first gets secreted by the cells of the stomach, it's called pepsinogen, and then the acid converts it to the active form of pepsin, and then pepsin is what will break down these proteins. And then there's something called intrinsic factor, which helps with vitamin B12 absorption. There's limited absorption of nutrients by the stomach. Typically, the only thing that gets absorbed by the stomach are some medications, water, alcohol, but there's not a lot of absorption of actually nutrients taking place. Now, carbohydrates and proteins, those will pass through the stomach relatively quickly, but after a fatty meal, you probably notice you feel full for hours. Fatty contents are held in the stomach for hours, sometimes 3 to 6 hours.